Who's coming in?
See who our participants are, because everybody shows up. That's it.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to the planning board meeting for May 17th. I'll start off by calling the roll. Alden Clark.
Here.
Jeff Delisle.
Here.
Bob Cobb.
Here.
Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Rick Taylor is here. And your three members absent: Heather Rogers, John Walters, and Richard Lee. So the first item on our agenda is an application for a special permit for Richard and Janet Borneman at 8 Avon Avenue. We learned last night, I guess, that we would not have 6 members present. And we need 6 members to act on a special permit, 2/3 of our total membership. And so we informed the applicant, and the applicant has requested a continuance to June 7th. So can I have a motion to continue that application to June 7th?
I'll move continue to June 7th.
Alden moves, thank you.
Second.
Bob seconds. And since we do not have anybody remote, we can just do it by ayes rather than roll call. So all in favor of continuing?
Aye.
Any opposed? So it is continued.
Does that mean we don't find out what this is?
I'm sorry.
Does that mean you're not gonna talk about it at all?
We can't talk about it yet.
Not this evening. It will be taken up by the board at the continuation date, which is June 7th, here again in this room.
In the future, though, is there some way to, we travel for that?
Yes,
Is there
sorry.
something-
We actually found out about this somewhat late, as the chair mentioned.
I
The
mean,
one-
not for us, but she drove in from like Weymouth.
Oh, yeah, understood. I can tell you right now that if you're looking at the city calendar, what we do try to do, even if it's later in the time frame, as we found out sort of last minute, here, these alignments of membership versus the continuance request, which we got today. We actually post on the city calendar. So when you're looking at the meeting, what we try to do is immediately post where the calendar meeting is. Look for that. We usually put it in bold, request to continue. And that's at least to let the public know as best we can in the office and the staff.
Okay,
Uh,
fair enough. Thank you.
I
Thank you.
apologize. Sorry you had to plan.
No, trouble. Thank you.
Okay, the next item is continued discussion, continued public hearing for ordinance 141, the zoning amendment for short-term rental units. We have a public hearing that is continued. So the first thing that I'd like to do is just open up to further public comment. If anybody has any additional public comment since our last meeting. No public comment? Come on forward. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jeanette Isabella, 100 Water Street. You know, I've lived in this city for 38 years. So I'm one of the new old Newburyport people. If I wanted to live in a business district, I would have lived closer to downtown, in the midst of businesses. I just don't agree with allowing businesses that can do whatever they want in a neighborhood. It degrades the neighborhood, and it's really an insult to people who have bought their home in what they thought was a quiet area. I mean, I live on Water Street, so I'm not looking for, you know, hearing the birds sing at 5 in the morning. I get the reality of where I live. But it's different than having people coming and going who you don't know. And in my own experience, and some of you may have heard this before, I do have a 3-unit building. And there was an instance where my tenant on a summer night was with friends in the kitchen. And someone just walked in to the kitchen and had been drinking. And there were 2 guys there, and they saw him out. And there was no incident. But then he came back, and there was an incident, and the police were called. He was just at the wrong house. He'd come from wherever he had been drinking, didn't know the area, and he walked in, and that could have been ugly. It was already unpleasant, but it could have been, much worse. These are the kinds of things that people shouldn't have to put up with. We pay high taxes, we try to keep our property up. No, it's just not fair to have businesses cropping up within what you thought was a neighborhood you could sort of count on, knowing who was there. And the last thing I want to say is that, so my house is on the corner of Water and Lime. Now, if you're familiar with the South End, you already know what's happened to the South End. There used to be places you could park and it was quieter. But then the big houses got turned into, 4 condo units. And, I don't know, you could count on one hand, any day of the week, how many parking spots you can get on Lime Street. All the way in. It's just filled with cars, and that's because things were allowed to be done that shouldn't have been done to cram up the neighborhood and take away what I bought into 38 years ago. So I don't know. I just hope you really consider the people who are there, who are committed to the neighborhood and the city. And the older I get, the more I'm concerned about a further degradation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jane Snow, 9 Coffin Street. I agree with Jeanette. My family has lived on my street for, since 1935. And at one point it was pretty much family and, we've lost some, but I'm still there. And I had the mispleasure of having a short-term rental as a neighbor. They never said anything. And like Jeanette, I had my garage door open. I was working in the backyard and I came around and there was a man standing in the middle of my garage. I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just taking a look around. I thought you were having a yard sale." I said, "No, those are my 2 cars and my things. Get out." Followed by a bachelor party that they parked all over my lawn, all over my yard. Very drunk. And when I called the police, they said, "Oh, no, we don't touch short-term rentals. Nope." I said, "Well, I'm here by myself." So I think for me, I understand that people are trying to make a little extra money. But the big thing is there is no enforcement. And if you get into a situation where you have a unruly guest next to you, you have no backup. And I don't think a 70-year-old should be put in a position that when I call the police, I'm told, "Oh, no." So I think you have a hard decision, and I can understand that you're trying to allow, for equal. But today too, reading the paper, we have such a crisis throughout the state, as you could read the Daily News, with a place for people to live, and an affordable place for people to live. And when we continue to allow these units to be rented at, $500, $600, $700 a night, it really hurts, because the last tally I took, we had like 280 of these in Newburyport, and yet very few people have registered the unit. And so how much is it going to cost us to constantly chase them to make sure that they pay what they're supposed to pay? And I hope that you make a strong decision that if you have to allow a few, but make it that it has to be an owner occupied unit. It's not an investment unit. And that they're there to deal with the problems, not the neighborhood. And I'm sorry, but I do think parking should be part of it. If, you shouldn't be playing musical bingo in your own yard to be able to find a place to park. And I visited Jeanette in her neighborhood and forget it, you're not parking on Lime Street. So I understand it's a tough decision for you folks. You kind of put between a rock and a hard place, people that want to be able to buy property and invest it. But I also would hope that you would consider those who bought their house, and my family bought on this property. I did this to be into a neighborhood, not into a business district. And just please think of that as you're making your deliberations. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else? What's that? So.
There haven't been any hands remotely.
Thank you for that. I wish that screen were behind me. Okay, so with that, I'll close the public comment then for the evening. And so we have a couple of ways we could proceed. One is to go right to our deliberations, or close the public hearing and go right to our deliberations and draft the report. And the other would be to keep the public hearing open if you feel like there's value to do that and continue on to our next meeting. If we close the public hearing tonight, or whenever we close the hearing, that starts the clock running for the city council to take action. And I guess there are mixed opinions on the council, but the sponsor is okay with closing the hearing. I guess the chair of planning and development is as well. So I guess we can start the process and see. And just for background for the audience, in preparation for this, I put together a draft report from the planning board. And I circulated it to the planning board members. I asked that we not discuss it offline, but I wanted to give it to the planning board members to have a chance to make comments, additions, subtractions, modifications, in the hope that that would move us forward more quickly.
If I may add,
Yeah.
the chair, this was, I think, an attempt to summarize or capture the conversation, the dialogue, quite what it had the last meeting
Right.
here, and sort of encapsulate that as best as possible.
It's trying to capture the major points, not trying to capture every detail, but trying to get a sense of what the issues are. So I guess one approach would be for me to read that into the record. So some of on the screen, it probably makes sense to read it into the record. And then ask board members to comment and make changes. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? Okay with that? Okay. Okay, let's go ahead then. I'll just go through it. And this will let members of the public know the types of issues that I summarized. And again, this is my attempt to capture it. And I fully expect that there should be some changes as a result of our discussion tonight. So this is the draft planning board report and recommendations on the proposed zoning amendment regarding short-term rental units. In accordance with Mass General Laws, Chapter 48, Section 5, the planning board submits to the city council this report with recommendations concerning ordinance 141, a proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance to allow short-term rental units. The planning board discussed the proposed zoning ordinance amendment in a joint public hearing with the city council's planning and development committee on February 16th, 2022, should be 2023, sorry, and in the board's meetings on May 3rd and May 17th, 2023. The board adopted this report at its meeting on May 17th, 2023. The planning board recognizes that it is necessary to adopt zoning regulations to define both the locations where STRUs may be located and the standards for such uses. The board generally supports the overall approach represented by the current proposed ordinance, which contains separate regulations and standards for 3 classes of short-term rental units: owner-occupied, investor, and Plum Island. The proposed ordinance appropriately recognizes Plum Island's distinct history and character as a beach community with numerous seasonal short-term rentals, while being more restrictive of STRUs in mainland residential neighborhoods. Board members, as well as residents, have raised concerns about the following specific issues with the proposed ordinance. First, owner-occupied STRU definition. An STRU, quote, located on the same lot as the operator's primary residence, end quote, is not very different in nature or neighborhood impact from an investor STRU, particularly where the owner of an investor STRU may live in the same neighborhood as the STRU. It may be more appropriate to regulate a second unit on an owner-occupant's lot in the same way as an investor STRU. Next, owner's absence from owner-occupied STRU. The 120-day allowance for an owner-occupant to be absent from the STRU blurs the line between owner-occupants and investors, especially in the case of an owner-occupied STRU that is not the owner's principal residence. That is, a second unit on the same lot as the owner's residence. If the definition of owner-occupied STRU is changed to apply only to the owner's primary residence, the 120-day non-residency provision could remain, but otherwise it should be reduced. Next, number of bedrooms and occupants. The proposed ordinance sets limits on both the number of bedrooms and the number of guests, but links the off-street parking requirement only to the number of bedrooms. This creates a potential ambiguity in determining the required number of parking spaces. This ambiguity could be resolved by tying the number of occupants to the number of bedrooms, for example, 2 occupants per bedroom. Neighborhood input. Some planning board members strongly believe that a formal process for notice to and input from abutters and other neighbors should be required for all STRUs in residential neighborhoods. As a consequence, these members oppose allowing any STRUs as of right, and that's P of the use table, in these neighborhoods, which would mean requiring a special permit for all STRUs. Treatment of existing STRUs. There are a number of investor-owned STRUs in the residential zoning districts, and also a number of STRUs, both owner-occupied and investor-owned, that do not comply with the off-street parking requirements of the proposed ordinance. Some planning board members would like to see an allowance in the ordinance for continued STRU use of such units. This allowance could be in the form of a time-limited amnesty provision or an owner-limited exception, such as the one included in Salem's STRU ordinance. Licensing and enforcement. Although the planning board's purview is limited to advising the council on the zoning ordinance, the issue of enforcement and thus the licensing ordinance seems inextricable from the zoning discussion. There is a concern that the city does not have the resources to respond effectively and expeditiously to ordinance and license violations or to neighbor complaints, particularly on weekends when problems may be more likely. The planning board recommends that the above issues be further reviewed and addressed before a final ordinance is enacted. So, as this says, rather than go through a point-by-point vote on each of the provisions that is up for discussion, my approach here was to highlight the key issues that I thought were, came out of the discussion at our last meeting, and just advise the council that these still need to be addressed. But I'm certainly open to any other revisions to change or strengthen any part of this. And so I'll just open the floor for discussion. Yeah.
So, with respect to the treatment of existing STRUs, just, I think, I have been a proponent of this, but I don't agree, and I don't know if other people did agree with the second part of that, that the parking requirements would apply. I would like them protected or allowed to continue, but only if they comply with parking. Opinions on that.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point to have that
part of this amnesty provision.
To basically take that out so that the, so only to include the piece about existing investor owned STRs, not to include an amnesty for off-street parking.
Like to strike after the zoning districts. That's what I would do. And then as far as the amnesty provision, I'm not exactly sure what we mean by that. Is that something like I think at a minimum, like a sunset provision, maybe they can continue to operate. Is that what you're thinking by amnesty?
Yeah, I guess when I said a time limited amnesty, that's what I meant. I had to do it within a certain time and phase it out. That was one option, and then the other option was the one that Salem had, which is you could continue, but it was limited to the existing property.
Yeah, so my preference would be the exception and the amnesty as a second option.
Any comments on those ideas?
Yeah, I guess just for the record, I just have a concern about the concept of amnesty to begin with. That amnesty implies that granting relief to someone who has perhaps done something that is outside of what was required, which is the case here. All of these units are operating outside of the approval of the city, whether the city has actively enforced that or not. And I just have a very hard time agreeing with the concept of granting amnesty to some properties and then applying new regulations to other properties. I think that's a very uneven way of dealing with this. So I am just, for the record, I am not in favor of amnesty. I think properties need to comply with the regulations, and if they don't comply, there's a process.
So I think it's a good point. So the way I drafted it was some planning members would like to see. I think I can end it by saying other planning members should not want to see any amnesty. Just because we are in disagreement.
I think we're setting up regulations here that everybody should comply with. And I don't think granting amnesty to properties which might be outside of those new regulations is unsuitable.
So Rick, I think overall your memo is really good, but there's a couple of things missing that I think could be added from my perspective that I think were discussed, and perhaps I could suggest a couple of things. I mean, I left the last meeting thinking there was, at least 3 kind of fatal flaws here. It seems like we're all in agreement on the licensing and the lack of enforcement, so that's great. A couple others though that I think still should be at least mentioned here, because, and it really to tag on to my colleagues' comments, I actually would not be. I think it'd be great if amnesty was reduced or removed as well, believe it or not. I think one thing I said last time I didn't articulate very well, but I feel very strongly in looking at some other cities that wrestle with this, like Burlington, Vermont, and a few others, is I really do believe that, having a lot of investor-owned STRUs will displace long-term rentals, which is a very important part of the housing stock. I think it would be good to make a note of that here, that at least lets the city council know that one of the goals should be to keep an eye on that. Perhaps, as I said last time, that could be addressed by a cap on licenses or something like that. But obviously, this could get out of hand. Everyone can kind of imagine how that could happen. The second fatal flaw that I just don't think is addressed here. I know you might have thought about it, and I'm very sympathetic to the zoning board of appeals having served on that, is the lack of any criteria, because 10H7 is very specific in its criteria. I try to think of other criteria, like a ZBA member would have, And everything I thought of was again a licensing, something that would be solved by licensing basically. Because we're really just talking about a more intensive residential use. But I mean, if you take it to an extreme, like we wouldn't allow bars even in a business use without a liquor license scheme, you know, so we need a licensing scheme here. So, you know, I think about this, like, I think if we start the clock for the council, we really put the onus on them to develop that in parallel very carefully, because the zoning, I just don't think can stand alone. So you can't say all that in the memo, but I think it would be worth saying that without a very rigorous licensing scheme that can allow the ZBA to say that a use is not substantially more detrimental, they've really got to address all the concerns that they're hearing from the public. And perhaps you can tie that together in the memo from a zoning perspective, because that's really all we can talk about.
Yeah, I understand it. I was trying to mention that in terms of the licensing. I'm not really sure if you could come up with some wording for me, because I was struggling with it. I actually went back and looked at CBA special permit criteria. And they seemed fine to me. I mean, I was going to say, you know, it was. I'm not really sure. I don't know how you would come up with criteria that would be specific to a short-term rental. I haven't figured that out.
I think it gets to the potential intensity of the use, which I think actually I lost my place there. But there's one of 10H7's, A7, I believe, I'm just not finding it. Gets to, you know, the intensity of the use, which is, this is like a very intense residential use, basically. This is the most intense residential use. It's bordering on a hotel, which is why we're considering, why other laws and ordinances are starting to consider a business. It's like right on that line, right? So if you had licensing that basically provides some sort of enforcement and limit of scope and other safeguards, you could imagine crossing the line slightly into residential use again versus into hotel or, you know, bar, because it sounds like a lot of these are basically party zones sometimes if it's not regulated correctly. So is it 10, 7? Yeah, 7. There it is, right in the middle of the page. The requested use will not, by its addition to the neighborhood, cause an excess of that particular use.
That's excess of short-term rental. That particular use that's the use of the document.
Yeah,
So that's why I was wondering how we could. I mean, I suppose
I don't know.
I don't know.
Other than licensing, I mean, licensing could address that, but zoning can't. I don't think.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. So you'd like, would it help somehow to strengthen that last bullet point in my report to say, I'm not really sure how I would do it, because that's what it's about licensing.
If I may,
Just to make one point, I believe that the state has suggested that short-term rental units are not a residential use, they are a commercial use. So I think that puts it, I mean, to reinforce what you're saying, you know, if it's a commercial use, it has an impact on the neighborhood. It should go through a licensing process. I mean, commercial uses right now are not permitted in a lot of the residential districts that we're talking about. So this becomes a special consideration.
Is there, I'm not sure, I'm not aware of it. So the state has declared that these are commercial uses?
My understanding is out of the case in Linfield, state courts have deemed that short-term rental units are commercial uses, not residential. I think it's.
if I may, I would concur. I think Bob is correct that the most recent case law that we have on this does make it clear that it's some other case law that we're going to come down the road, that this is a quasi-commercial use in nature, less so a residential use. So the discussion was being had there about, you know, how much is allowed in residential district versus, say, you know, a downtown. And I think my understanding, I know we heard from at least one ZBA member about this same question, you know, what kind of criteria do we talking about? What kind of criteria do they use for this? How do they know when it's too much, you know, for the neighborhood, or you know, if they make an excess, you know, so to speak, the language that's used as an excess. I think that licensing or a cap of that nature is probably the best way of doing something like that, because it's actually a measurable mark in which that can be understood or known. that threshold has been reached. It's a little harder, I think, to expect the zoning board of appeals if they're looking at ostensibly the same situation on various different properties, and there could be an influx of a bunch of them, let's say in any given neighborhood. We don't know. At what point can they make a distinguishment, between those different properties or situations if they all comply with the parking requirements and so forth? How do they know when that threshold has been crossed if they have to issue the same decision for every one? Because putting aside, we sometimes hear from attorneys about the precedent setting decisions. I don't necessarily, buy that that's applicable in every instance, but it does make it harder for the board if they've made a determination based on a certain set of criteria or information, and the next application or a bunch of others like it look exactly the same. It would be harder, I think, for them to say no to that one, just for context. So that's why I think, this question of, to me, that's the thing that stands out here in terms of those criteria, special permit criteria. If we're trying to address the sheer quantity, so to speak, there's various different ways of getting there, but a cap could be one way of doing that that isn't necessarily expecting a volunteer board to determine when that threshold has been crossed.
So it would seem to me that a cap would have to be in zoning, whereas licensing would deal with the criteria. If you, or you could have a cap on the number of licenses.
Right, I guess my point is that
But
somehow
that
that
was
would
zoning
have,
board also.
somehow that would have to be addressed, but not by way of, I guess, unless the ordinance, and maybe Jamie, I think at this one point, unless the ordinance has some specific threshold in it, whether it's license or zoning, unless there's some sort of cap in here, it's a little harder to determine when does the board know that they've really substantively reached that threshold. So I do think, I was thinking again, initially along the lines of licensing, but either way, that would be one way potentially to press that isn't leaving it more in question what criteria they use to determine that threshold has been reached, that it's an excess or a detriment to the neighborhood. But like Bob said, the courts have determined it's commercial use of nature, and therefore the question of how much of that commercial use can be allowed in a residential neighborhood, I think is the current policy discussion.
I mean, I do recall having served on the board at occasion, we would approve of a restaurant use or something like that that was going to need an alcohol license, right? And whether they got it or not is independent of the board's decision. They're relying on the fact that there's another authority in the city to regulate that aspect of that use. So, I think, and here it's just that we're flying blind. I mean, I think, the zoning has to happen. It has to be addressed this way. And I think a really good case has been made for that, to make it legal. But in parallel, there has to be this licensing scheme that works together. And it seems to be unusual that this is coming first. I understand the politics of why that is, but I think if we start the clock ticking for the council, which I'm inclined actually now to do, I think we just need to make sure we're making it clear to them. We think we're putting the onus on them to develop that licensing scheme very quickly because they have to go together. And if you have a licensing scheme that the ZBA can rest their hat on to say, look, as long as all these other things in the licensing scheme are complied with, including a cap, maybe even a cap by neighborhood or something, I mean, it could get really interesting. Then, then they can say, well, look, this is just like we did in any other neighborhood. It actually would make their job a lot easier, but it still makes the licensing the linchpin of all this, like how it's enforced, how it's doled out, how many units any one particular investor could have. I'd love to see limits on that too, but I don't think you could do that from a zoning perspective. I think that has to be done with licensing. So.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, just given that's why I like the language that you use, talking about the licensing ordinance being inextricable from this ordinance. I think that's
You have to.
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
If I could just add to the discussion about licensing and the cap versus other methods. I think for me, the important issue is to not have uncontrolled proliferation of units in the city driven by real estate interest, property management interest, because that's really the reality of this right now. This is not mom and pop, sharing a bedroom occasionally to make a few extra dollars. This is a business. It's a commercial use. It generates traffic. It generates renter traffic. It generates cleaners, property managers, maintenance people. That traffic cycles in and out of our neighborhoods every single day. So it is a commercial use. I think there are two ways of trying to limit that. One is to create a cap. The number of licenses that you would issue. I think that, to me, is maybe possible. I don't know. I think that might become a difficult discussion. But what I have been suggesting previously is that the physical nature of each of the individual properties becomes a limiting feature to the number of STRUs. So if you have a parking requirement, for example, that has a way of just, providing a built-in limitation on the number of STRUs that can be approved in our neighborhoods, because there are only so many properties that can provide that parking. So the physical nature of the properties is the limiting feature of it. And that, to me, supports the idea that the reality of our neighborhoods are dense, small properties, lots of on-street parking. It should have a limitation. And I think if we use things like the regulations, which the byproduct is you limit the amount of units that can be approved in a neighborhood because it just physically can't comply. To me, that's a more effective and a more kind of black and white way of controlling it than trying to create a cap. But I think both are worth talking about, but I think it's important somehow to acknowledge that you have to limit the growth.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to offer, making a response to comments that we made there. One, I think Jamie had made a reference to what the zoning can do, and I just want to clarify. My reading of it is that the zoning can, properly, and I think it's been reflected here, but in certain prior discussions, a distinction between investor units and sort of owner occupied, or folks who are sort of operating on the property very locally. I think that, to me, I read that as almost like as if there was a piece of case law that said, right now we have the case law that says residential, commercial, and the courts have concluded that it's more commercial in nature than residential. Here, if it was being run by someone who's not really, on the property or around all the time, that's an investor unit. Conceptually, to me, that seems to suggest that another piece of case law would put that further on the commercial end of the spectrum, which would be that it's more commercial in nature if it's being run by an investor than it is if it's being run by someone who's on the property. So generically, that's just how I would look at it as the land use planner and the case law that I've seen. So that being the case, I do think it's possible and appropriate to look at, perhaps regulating those differently for that reason, the sort of commercial nature or how much commercial it is. I guess more so in residential districts, let's say, a business district. And I agree with I think the point Bob was making there, which is that I wasn't necessarily viewing it as just a license cap. If that's a tool that is desired to be used here, again, that's the mayor and the city council with input from the planning board and others. But if there is a cap used, I was actually seeing it as well as whatever criteria used to, appropriately moderate the number or mitigate the associated, impacts from a short-term rental like parking. So, thank you.
So I was poking around a little bit, and some other communities that are dealing with this, it looks like they limit the number per block face or per block or radius. I mean, I wonder if we would add something like that to the special permit criteria. I think it would go in a special permit rather than licensing.
So I was thinking about that too during this discussion. I don't think we'd even go with a special permit. I think it would go with the basic requirements. You could have, a short, just to pick a number out of the air, a short-term rental unit cannot be within 300 feet of any other previously approved short-term. You could do that. That could apply to both as of right and special permit. That's how communities do. I don't know that we have it in our ordinance. That's how some communities do things like sexually oriented businesses or bars or something like that. You kind of have a density. I don't have a problem with that. That's one of those. When we discussed it last time, the question that comes up is, who's the first person to get in the door? And that person eliminates all the others who are operating in the neighborhood. So, but it's a way to do it.
And I mean, maybe in the special permit criteria, maybe it's a presumption or maybe it's a strict limit, but a presumption that there's too much, that this use is
Oh, I
too
see.
much.
Yeah.
If there's a certain number, or maybe it's just a cap, straight cap on the block face. I don't know what the right numbers would be. And I think part of the problem with, part of why this is such a hard thing to grapple with is we don't really understand the numbers. There's an argument that we don't need to do this, but figuring out what the right number is in the town per block. I feel like we don't have great information to come up with a solid number, but I think it's a concept that is helpful. Could be helpful. And then I think, I don't know, sorry, if the special permit criteria, I think another thing that would be helpful to take into account, the zoning board was looking at an application for a special permit would be, a history of operation without complaint. I think that could be a factor that would lean in favor of granting a special permit. And in contrast, if somebody has had complaints, then that would go against granting a special permit. And can I make one more point? I do think in the special permit criteria that there should be a sort of the benefits of short-term rental units could be spelled out a little more, fleshed out, just because I do, the fact that the ZBA would always go against an STRU under the special permit criteria. I think that there should be, I think there are benefits to having some STRUs in town. And I think they should maybe be spelled out and made sure that they're considered in the process.
Before you what is it? I get your points. I guess what I'm concerned about is that I think that there's going to be a lot of the STRUs that are, say the ordinance follows the way it's going right now, and prohibits investor units in the south end, which is what it says right now. I still think that owner units may be an issue, especially if you're renting the second unit on the bottom of the first one, and they're not going to be subject to any special permits. So what you're talking about is good from the point of view of helping to guide the zoning board. But in the case of an as of right use, which may be the ones that are most impactful to the neighbors, I don't think we've got the way to get there.
Right. No, I agree, but I do think requiring every single unit to go to a special permit would be a nightmare for the ZBA.
That's not just on that note. That's why your second point, raising this point, potentially treating the owner occupied second adjacent units the same as investor units comes into play. I was just going to say one other quick thing. Is that we do have the limitation that there's only one allowed per operator, so that is a limiting factor already. So I just wanted us to keep that in mind.
And can I add, Bob, there are some parking requirements in here, right, for the bedrooms. Do you think they're not stringent enough? Is that-
I think for me, it's never been very clear. And Rick and I have had a couple of conversations about this, and I think there can be a table that basically defines the existing available parking, the number of bedrooms, the amount of parking that would be required off-street for each of those units, so that it was just absolutely black and white. I think the narrative description to me, when we start talking about underlying zoning, and I think that makes it very fuzzy for a lot of people. Definitely made it fuzzy for me, which is why I put together a spreadsheet to say, is this what we're actually saying? And I just think it's very important to make it clear. I don't necessarily violently disagree with anything that's being proposed here, but I think the language is not. And I would say, if I can, just two other things. In the context of talking about the value of STRUs to the city, and I have never disagreed with that at all. I think if we're drafting a recommendation to the city council, I think you should make a statement, Rick, to begin with, that reinforces the concept that this is really about protecting neighborhoods and residents' property and minimizing disruption. There is language in Councilor Z's proposal with the overall well-being of residents and neighborhoods in mind, to strike a balance between competing interests such as the need for long-term rental housing and the benefits of STRUs, and to minimize the adverse effects on residential properties and neighborhoods that may arise from residential properties being used as STRUs. I mean, if we could just put that in all capital letters and bold, I mean, that to me is still the priority.
So let me interrupt you. So what do you mean? You're saying that I should just copy from the ordinance back into our
I'm
report?
saying you don't need to say it word for word, but I would like it if the planning board strongly supported that criteria and those purposes that were stated by council. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, you know, the whole issue of owner presence during rentals. And I wanted to read from one of the previous proposals. You know, and this was from last year, and I think none of this was very controversial amongst the planning board when it was discussed a year ago. But you know, if you remember, there were limited share rental units, home share rental units, and owner adjacent rental units. So a limited share is you have a house, you're in the house, and you're renting part of the house on a short-term basis. And part of the language in that definition is at least one additional bedroom shall be exclusively used and occupied by the operator during the pendency of the use by STRU guests. The owner always has to be present when a portion of their house is rented. For home share rental units, this is where the 90 days or 120 days came in. For a home share unit, the unit is occupied when the operator is not physically present overnight, shall not exceed a total of 90 days per each calendar year. So the reality is the owner can't be present because they're renting their entire house. So there was a time limit placed on the rental of that property per calendar year, 90 days per calendar year. Now we're discussing 120 days, but that applied only to a home share rental unit. When we talked about owner adjacent rental units, which is, for example, a two-family house, except within Plum Island, the operator of an owner adjacent rental unit shall be personally and physically present overnight at all times that such STRU is occupied. So that was all language that was in previous versions of the amendment, all of which I think we generally agree with. I don't remember there being a lot of disagreement around that. And all of that reinforces the idea that the operator of the STRU is responsible to the neighborhood for the tenant and will be present to oversee the rental of their property. So that is why I have brought up the issue of the 120 days in Councilor Z's proposal, because in combining all three of these types and calling it all owner occupied, he's applied the 120-day allowance to everything, which means, in what was formerly an owner adjacent unit, the owner doesn't have to be there for 120 rental days out of the year. That's all summer, or that's every weekend for the entire year. So I think those are things that fundamentally change where we were with this last year in terms of placing responsibility on owners and operators to oversee their rental operations. And I really think Rick, you've made an effort to clarify that here. I think that's extremely important. That we try to describe this in a way that maintains that responsibility by owners relative to the rental.
So you're right, I did try to do it in the first two votes. I guess obviously I haven't succeeded as far as you're concerned. So maybe, maybe we need to continue those to another meeting and have somebody come back with more precise language than I have. I tried to say that in the first two votes.
I think what you're saying gets there, but I just want to make sure we all agree that that's the
Right, but it sounded to me like you were not satisfied with what I wrote. So I'm happy, again, I'm happy to get better language in there. And I guess,
But what you're suggesting is that definition of, I think what you're suggesting is the definition of owner occupied as it relates to the 120-day allowance. It's only a single thing. And I totally agree with it. And what was formerly called an owner adjacent unit would then shift from an owner occupant to an investor. Right also.
and would not be allowed in those.
I would agree.
So let's go back. Let's go back to some questions that I've been trying to do a combination of make notes on my draft and also take notes here. So let me just see if I've captured, if these changes capture enough of what we said. So in the next to last bullet, under treatment of existing short-term rental units, I was going to delete the phrase that does not comply with off-street parking requirements of the proposed ordinance, because that was, I think, your concern that we want to have them at least comply with the off-street parking requirements, not have any amnesty for that. And then I think there was a concern also about this, the sale type of thing, the owner limited exception, that we would only want to have a time limited amnesty provision. Is that the case, or?
I would not. I would allow them to continue to operate if they've been operating without any issues.
As long as they have the parking.
Be able to, yeah, but even if they were in the,
Yeah.
not in the R3.
And then I also have other planning board members do not agree with the concept of granting amnesty at all. Just to put that in there, just because it's what I'm hearing. And then on the last bullet, under licensing and enforcement, I would add something about the board recommends that a strong licensing ordinance be enacted before the zoning is changed. Just to make sure that happens. They're comfortable about that before they get to the point of changing the actual use requirements.
If I may,
Yes,
I'll leave it to you, but I don't know if you necessarily need to say beforehand, as long as it's at least simultaneously.
well, I think the point is that we would not want them to act on the zoning until they
work
knew
out.
exactly what the licensing was.
Right, I guess my point there was just that it could be perhaps that those details are worked out as long as the final adoption or, effective dates, right?
It could be, yes. I mean, the licensing only requires a majority vote, and the zoning requires a 2/3. So it's easier to adopt a license probably. So at least they would know what they were getting. And then the other, so I have Jamie's point about short-term rentals will displace long-term rentals, and maybe you want to add that as it's part of the preamble. Is that what you're thinking?
I saw that more of a rationale for a cap. And I think a lot of you had better ideas than me on how that can be achieved, combination of physical constraints, licensing. Give you a combination of all those as far as I'm concerned. You all had great ideas there. So, but it's the rationale for a cap, basically.
I guess the question is, do you think that should be included in our written report?
I certainly would like to see that, yeah. Because I think it's important that it's said.
Okay. And so we were talking about the density issue. 1 or 2 per block phase, not more than 1 to 300-foot radius. Whether it's a standard or a presumption for the zoning board to use in special permit analysis. Is there any further consideration?
Well, that tags on, the only reason I'm grabbing this, that tags on to the cap concept, because I actually thought also you all came up with better ideas than I had. Because I think what it got to was not letting them concentrate at the end of the day, right? I think which is more important than how many there are by total number in the city. It's how concentrated they are. So that was a fantastic idea.
Just one thing back on the embassy, since we're concerned with ones that haven't had complaints and so forth. I think it's a good point that the embassy runs with the owner and doesn't carry over. Since
But
we're
we
not talking about a time limit.
so
Yeah, I didn't know if you were saying we still would keep the time limited or just have it run with the owner.
I would say the owner.
Yeah, that's what I think would be better.
okay,
I
so
think do all of these, I think they all go with the owner, like the special permit, it's not, doesn't run with the land.
right, but we're talking about, for example, let's talk about an owner occupied short-term rental that doesn't have enough, well, we're requiring parking. So, okay, so it would be an investor unit in the south end that has the parking. So my question actually is it a sunset clause? Is it you have to be out of there in 2 years, 1 year, or does it go with you? Do it as long as is right owns the property.
For me, I think I would do it with the owner, but if they transfer the property, then that doesn't continue. Right, or, if it has to be a sunset provision, legally, we can't figure out a way, or.
Well, we can, I'm sure we can play it.
Yeah.
So it's good.
But otherwise, like even if it was a 2-year sunset provision, if they transferred the property, then I would think that the new owner would continue that. I mean, in my mind, it's really just, it's kind of been a gray area. People seem to have been able to successfully do this somewhat. It just seems fair to me to let them continue if it's not causing problems. I mean, I agree there is an issue about maybe they would be apartments, but also maybe people would just sell them and be in other homes.
Just, I guess I'm struggling with the idea that investor units might be shown as not permitted in certain Southend neighborhoods. But provide amnesty to existing investor units in the same neighborhood. I just don't have a hard time understanding how that's. So investor short-term rentals in R1 or R2, for example, are not. I think what's being proposed here is if something exists now in R1 or R2 neighborhood, there's a suggestion that they be granted. Yes. So I'm having a hard time reconciling that with the fact that it's not permitted going forward.
Right, I mean, I'm trying to capture all points of view, so I am saying
Yeah.
some members will like that and some don't.
I'm just-
Yeah.
just-
I think I've said that.
Just reinforcing my point.
Sounds to me like we need to see another draft before it goes to council.
Can I ask two more questions?
Yes.
On the second bullet point, which is talking about the 120-day allowance. The last sentence, which is the 120-day non-residency provision could remain, but otherwise it should be reduced. Could we add the words or eliminated? Because eliminated would be consistent with the language that I read from the previous proposal. The other question I have is in the third bullet point where we're talking about the number of occupants. I'm wondering if, for example, 2 occupants per bedroom in parentheses at the end, should that say adult occupants? I'm trying to imagine a couple showing up with their small child and renting a 1-bedroom unit, and there's language that says that. So do we need to clarify that?
It's fine.
Simple.
So. Do we feel like, I feel like I would be more comfortable if you looked at it. There's a lot of unanswered questions here. I've heard your comments, but I think we're some more distance to go. Final language. But
So would that be a continuation of both the deliberation as well as the public hearing to the next meeting?
I think at this point, we can close the public hearing and move on to just continue deliberations.
Okay, and would that be the very next step? Then would we?
Yes, because we've got, I think, we have 3 weeks to the next meeting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it it's the closing of our deliberation, not the closing of the public hearing that triggers?
It's the closing of the public hearing, but the council is not going to start looking at our recommendation until for a couple months anyway. So it really doesn't matter about closing the hearing. Sound good to everybody? So could I have a motion then to close the public hearing and continue deliberations to the June 7th?
I would move to close the public hearing and continue deliberations for the June 7th meeting.
Thank you. Second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes. Okay. So move forward. But I think we're getting closer.
Having trouble grappling with those first 2 points to see did that cover all the points that we had in the discussion. It's really tough.
Okay. So the next item on our agenda is approval of minutes of the meeting. Right? Yes, and unfortunately, although I did give Caitlin my comments on the May 19th minutes, April 19th minutes, we didn't advertise them.
Yeah, apologies. That was something that's my job is carrying the minutes from last meeting. We're supposed to be here, so we'll be suggested just putting it on the next agenda.
So put the April 19th minutes on the next agenda. So I've also sent in comments on May 3rd minutes. Anybody else have any comments to add, or
I already sent.
you send your comments? You have anything else to add on that? In that case, could I have a motion to approve the minutes of May 3rd?
Move to approve the minutes May 3rd.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, any updates?
Something comes to my right at the moment. I do want to pick up that discussion, just with our sort of starting working group on the everyday communities. I've been pulling off, I'm waiting to be a new DPS director, I'll be meeting with them, and then I can sort of simultaneously engage the initial analysis that they need to do on the water sewer end of things for capacity. We can have that information available for discussion, then I want to pick up the rest of that work, and then we'll be certainly back to our broader discussion here with the planning board and the city council about, what kind of zoning changes to make to comply
I've got a few things. One, Alden and I were at the table at the boards and commissions open house, and we were flooded with people who were really interested in joining the board.
Amazingly enough.
It was amazing, we had nonstop conversation, so it's good. So we may have, hopefully we'll have a couple of applications come through in the near future. Tonight would have been Don's last night, so tonight we had an 8-member board. June 7th, we're gonna have a 7-member board. So on June 7th, we only need 5 people to approve the Avon Street special permit. So, because our quantum has gone down. So hopefully we'll get that going. I've been working today on the waterfront west zoning, trying to do some drafting on that based on what our group did last summer and fall. And I am going to go a little bit further with that, and I'm going to send it out to the subcommittee to take a look at it. I think the biggest job is going to be design standards. It's easy, it's relatively easy for me to write kind of the mechanical parts of the zone. Created a use table and a parking table, that kind of stuff, and talked about resiliency and future flood elevations and all that. I think the design standards is going to be a tough part. Now, we do have a consultant. The mayor has hired a consultant to help him, I guess. I'm not sure who the consultant is helping, but to help draft zoning. So what I would like to do is to take that to a certain point, get a little bit more feedback from our subcommittee, and then hand it over, I guess, to the consultant to say, here's what the planning board is right now. And I'll bring it to planning board.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
Thank you. Related to that discussion, one thing that I think is important is, to me, this is one of the major continuity, point of continuity is the issue of massing, and there we have to think about other particulars for waterfront west development. I know there's also other factors to consider, but that one to me is substantively the most important one to have, consensus over here in the community, because it's the one that, continues to come up as a debate between NED, what we see from them in terms of the initial volume sort of they wanted versus what the committee was asking for, at least with the current zoning, and some sort of debate about whether that's in between, or is it just giving, what NED wants in terms of the height there. There's some sort of middle ground in there, presumably, that can be reached there to sort of address that. But my suggestion, I guess, my thought is just that perhaps before doing, I think we should move ahead with all these things. I'm not suggesting stop work on that. But before we get to the level of detail where we're in the design standards, all of that kind of starts to become integrated. I think that taking the sort of layout, the master development plan layout, I know that Jamie's done this models of work at that end of it. If we could take that and apply to it the sort of at least initial design standards, like stepping back about the floors, things like that, to it, and have that massing model help to illustrate based on a spatial layout of the site with a network that makes sense, right? Again, this is going back to sort of the sketch plan there, but a spatial layout that makes sense with that massing engaged in it. So we have these blocks essentially established. We have an idea of what that massing might look like. To back out of that, these other things and to keep going from there. My one concern, I guess, is just that we reach some, agreement on that major, element or issue, because all the other ones are in there, but that one will obviously be key when we go to the adoption, when we go to the public discussion of what should happen in the Waterfront West. There'll be some discussion of what's the appropriate scale, and there's various different opinions that both about that. But I think if we can apply that to the model and therefore have a 3D model that helps illustrate some of that, that would be really helpful. Not just doing the text of the document, but being able to have a model that shows massing wise why we think X, Y, or Z is appropriate, at different points across the site.
The meeting that I attended, I had a conversation with consultants afterwards. And we were talking about the 5-story height limitation. And to me, that it becomes an economic question. And I think it would be very hard for us to be specific about where height should happen. What I was saying, at the meeting is, I think if you set a height limitation of 5 stories, can't exceed 5 stories. If you set a criteria about parking, that parking must be structured parking, it's either a podium or it's a mid-block, multi-level garage with residential wrapped around it. There are multiple solutions for that, but if you say that the criteria is parking must be hidden from the street, and if you then define the nature of the streets and the active uses that line those streets, then it's up to New England Development to come back with the density of residential that works for them, the number of structured parking spaces that supports all of that, and I think by establishing that criteria, you allow them the flexibility to play with this a little bit and make it work economically. So there may be other finer, comments related to setbacks at the 5th floor and things like that, which I totally agree with. But I think if you define the nature of the project and give them the ability to establish the number of units and the number of parking spaces and how all of that comes together, I think we might get to an answer with them a little more quickly than us trying to be prescriptive.
Actually, I have opposite view. I think with that area, we need to be as prescriptive as we can be. I do think that if we get to the point of trying to write zoning that is open to interpretation as to whether they're meeting the standard of, if it doesn't say something about massing, then they're going to be able to say, this meets your criteria.
So I think what I'm suggesting is prescriptive because it's defining the nature of the streets. It's defining the nature of the street wall. It's giving them a maximum height. It's telling them parking has to be concealed. If you add to that setbacks that are all about bringing daylight to public spaces and things like that, that sounds pretty
So
prescriptive.
I'm not sure what you're saying is, I thought you were saying that it couldn't apply a maximum height to it.
No, I'm saying apply that. Tell them you can't exceed 5 stories.
Okay.
But where that happens and what the resulting residential density is up to them because they have to balance that with the cost of structured parking the way we're asking them to do it. But I think that is.
So it is, I thought you were saying that we were going to be giving them guidelines that they had to come back to us to show how they were going to do it. You're saying, you're actually saying standard zoning.
I'm saying you don't tell them how many residential units.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you.
Because this is an economic puzzle for them. They need to figure it.
Yeah,
But we create the argument.
at a previous meeting, I said the same thing and said, I don't think that the number of units is something we should be concerned with at all. I think we just want to talk about the character. Metrics that define, the outside of what we would allow. Yeah. So it's just the density measure that you're saying that we will.
Yeah, I think that what I heard at that meeting is, a lot of points of view about hotel. A surprising lack of support for a hotel. So I think we need to think about that. What
I'm trying to work with is something that would give an incentive to a hotel.
I think the city has to help out.
Well, I'm thinking also about density incentive also.
If I could just add one comment to that, I think this is maybe a meetings, but it's a really interesting contrast to see the discussion of whether or not a hotel is feasible or even appropriate in Waterfront West. There's been a long-term discussion about that, both NED and then the city side. And here with short-term rental units having the pressures of short-term rental units in residential neighborhoods, it's interesting to see that contrast there.
Put all the short-term rental units in a single building in Waterfront West and call it a hotel.
I think the other thing we talked about related to a hotel, and I don't want to drag this out to what the hotel does in terms of that overall plan is it provides a catalyst for activity. It anchors the public space. It provides, a center of retail activity, hotel activity. It brings people to the waterfront. If there isn't a hotel, there has to be a point of view about allowing some other anchor use / retail / restaurant that would also bring people to the waterfront. Otherwise, this becomes a very quiet condominium development on the waterfront, and it's not a place for the broader public to go. So I think if it's not a hotel, then we should think about what the alternative.
Okay, well, to be continued. Anybody else have anything that they would like to bring up before we close the meeting? If not, then I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.